He died holding my hand, and the very next day, his family erased me from his life. But the love we shared lived on quietly, changing everything in ways no one could imagine. It started with the rain that wouldn't stop the night. Daniel collapsed. We were supposed to be celebrating our 5th anniversary. Nothing big, just dinner and laughter and a slow walk back home, but halfway through dessert, his hand dropped the fork and he looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize, wide, confused, like he was trying to remember where we were or who I was. I called his name twice, and then he slumped forward. The waiter screamed and everything became a blur. The hospital was cold, too cold for August, and I remember shivering, not from the air, but from the silence that settled after the doctor said he was gone. It didn't make sense. He was 35, healthy. No signs, no warnings, just gone in a heartbeat. I sat in that plastic chair for hours, holding the ring on my finger like it was the only thing keeping me from drifting away. When his family arrived the next morning, I expected grief. I expected hugs or tears or anything that looked like shared pain, but instead his mother looked through me like I was someone sitting in her seat. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask if I was okay. She asked where his things were and if he had written a will. I thought maybe shock had made her cold, that maybe later she would break down, but she didn't. She only got colder. The funeral was arranged within 2 days. His brother insisted I ride in a separate car. They said they needed space for the family. I watched through tinted glass as they lowered Daniel into the ground, standing alone while they circled the casket like I was a guest and not his wife. I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind them that he died holding my hand, that we had shared a life, a home, a bed, dreams, but no one looked at me, not really. Back at the house, our house, the place we had painted together, where our photos still hung, his cousin came with a clipboard and a tight smile. She said, Daniel's parents were taking over everything, that I should begin packing my things because the house belonged to them now. I laughed at first because it was absurd. We had bought it together. We both paid the mortgage. My name was on every document, but then she handed me a letter signed by his mother claiming legal ownership, and I realized they had prepared for this, not his death maybe, but the aftermath. I didn't fight back. Not that day. I packed slowly, numbly. I stared at the spot where his shoes used to be. The closet still smelled like him. His shirt still hung like he'd come home and change into one. I found a note he had written for our anniversary, hidden in the drawer behind his cologne. It said, forever isn't long enough with you, and I cried so hard I couldn't stand. The last thing I took was a photo of us on the beach the year we got married. I left the keys on the counter and closed the door behind me, not just to a house, but to a chapter I hadn't been ready to end. I moved into a small apartment near the old bookstore we used to visit. On weekends, it was nothing like the house we shared. No garden, no fireplace, no laughter, just silence and boxes and the hum of a fridge that reminded me I was alone. I spent days staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything I loved vanished so fast I didn't call anyone. I didn't answer texts. People don't know how to sit with your pain. They want you to be okay before you are ready. One evening, I went to the cemetery. I stood by Daniel's grave with trembling hands. I brought sunflowers. He used to joke that I reminded him of them, bright even in storms. I spoke to the stone like he could hear me. I told him I missed his stupid jokes and his morning coffee routine and how he always sang off key in the shower. I told him his family had erased me like I never existed and I didn't know how to fight ghosts. Weeks passed. I got a job at a local library. The routine helped, the silence stayed, but the ache dulled just enough for me to breathe again one afternoon while shelving books. I heard someone say his name. Daniel. My heart stopped. I turned around and saw his sister. She looked startled to see me, as if I had risen from the dead. She said she thought I had left the country, that her mother told everyone I had taken the insurance money and run. I stood there stunned. I told her the truth. I hadn't seen a single dollar, that I had been kicked out, lied to, and discarded. She looked like she didn't know what to believe, but in her eyes, I saw a flicker of doubt, not in me, but in her own family. She walked away quickly, and I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but 2 days later she returned. She brought an envelope full of papers and a face full of shame. She had gone through some files, found letters. Daniel had written notes mentioning our future plans, a file with both our names on the house documents. She whispered that her mother had manipulated everyone. She apologized over and over, but the damage had already been done. I thanked her, but didn't say much. I couldn't trust anyone, not yet, but that night, I slept without crying for the first time in weeks. Because somewhere someone believed me again. I started writing everything down, every memory, every conversation, every moment with Daniel. I wanted to remember what was real, not what his family tried to erase, and slowly, I began to piece myself back together, piece by fragile piece. I stopped attending family holidays, birthdays, anything that reminded me of a life. I no longer belonged to my friends, reached out less, and I didn't blame them. Grief makes people uncomfortable. It lingers too long and doesn't wear well in public. I tried to convince myself I was okay, but every night, I checked the mailbox hoping for something from Daniel. Something he left behind that they forgot to steal. One morning, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a small wooden box. It was the one Daniel used to keep on his nightstand. I hadn't seen it since the night he died. Inside were Polaroids of us, concert tickets from the show where he first told me he loved me, and a tiny velvet pouch that held the necklace he gave me. On our first Christmas together, there was also a letter written in his handwriting dated a week before he passed. In the letter, he talked about wanting to surprise me for our anniversary, about how he felt like the luckiest man alive, how he couldn't wait to grow old with me, how he hoped one day we'd have a daughter who had my laugh, and his stubbornness reading it broke me open and stitched me back together all at once. I clutched the box to my chest and cried for hours, not just for the loss, but for the love that was still real even in his absence. I started sharing our story on a small blog. Not many people read it, but those who did sent messages of warmth and understanding, strangers telling me that my pain made them feel seen. One woman said she had been erased too, after losing her partner. Her Message felt like a hug I didn't know I needed. Then one evening, a man knocked on my door. He was older, dressed in a suit, his eyes tired but kind. He introduced himself as Daniel's father. I froze. I hadn't seen him since the funeral he said he didn't come to. Argue he had read my blog and seen the letters his daughter brought back. He admitted he had believed his wife without question and that it was a mistake, he told me. Daniel had loved me deeply, that everyone saw it, but they let their pride and control blind them. He apologized. He handed me a photo album filled with pictures I hadn't seen before, ones from Daniel's childhood to our wedding day moments. I thought they had destroyed. He said it was time. I had them back, and then he left. No demands, no expectations, just quiet. Honesty. It didn't undo the pain, but it mattered more than he could know. That night, I didn't feel erased, I felt remembered, and that was enough to keep going. Weeks passed, and I kept the album beside my bed, opening it on days when the ache returned, just to remind myself that what we had was real and that I wasn't invisible. I found an attorney not for revenge, but for clarity. I wanted to understand how they had been able to take everything from me so quickly and quietly. The lawyer was kind surprised. I hadn't come sooner. He said what they did wasn't just cruel, it might have been illegal, especially if the will Daniel had drafted was found. I had no idea. Daniel had written a will, but the lawyer suggested filing a motion to request a search. It took time, paperwork, and silence. But then an old friend of Daniel's reached out. He had been Daniel's coworker and said he remembered Daniel mentioning something about leaving a sealed envelope with his firm just in case. It was real. Inside was a copy of a will dated a year before Daniel's death, naming me as his sole beneficiary. The lawyer took it straight to court, and I watched from the back row as the judge raised an eyebrow and said, "This changes everything." It wasn't about the house or the money. It was about the truth about Daniel. His voice being heard after death and mine being acknowledged after silence. The family contested, but the documents spoke louder than their objections. Within weeks, the house was legally mine again, along with the savings and the things they had tried to erase. I didn't move back in. Instead, I went one last time, walked through each room and thanked it for the memories. Then I sold it and used the money to start something new, a small coffee shop with a bookshelf in the back dedicated to Daniel with our photo in a frame and a note that read, "For those who love and lose and still choose to love again." Customers sometimes ask about the story behind the photo, and I tell them a version, a soft one, with more smiles than tears, and I watch them nod like they understand, because somehow we all carry pieces of someone we had to say goodbye to. The coffee shop became more than a business. It became a sanctuary. People came in for coffee but stayed for the warmth, for the sense that even in a world full of loss, something soft still existed. I hung Daniel's letter in the back, framed behind glass where the sun caught it. In the afternoon, people would pause and read it. Some would tear up, others would smile, and every so often someone would leave a note in return, a message to their own lost love taped gently beneath his words. One afternoon, a young woman sat at the counter for hours. She didn't order anything, just stared at the photo of me and Daniel. Eventually, she walked up and said, "Thank you, not for the coffee, but for keeping something so honest alive." She said she had lost someone too, that she'd been made to feel like her love didn't count because there was no ring, no papers, just time and memories. I told her love doesn't ask for permission to matter, and we both smiled, like we knew something sacred. Months passed and the shop thrived. People started calling it a place for hearts to rest. A local paper did a story, and suddenly, I was getting letters from across the country. Stories of love and grief and survival, people who felt seen just because someone else had dared to speak aloud what they'd been carrying in silence. It was never about going viral. It was about connection, one soul at a time. One morning, I found an envelope under the door. No name, no return address. Inside was a photo I had never seen before. Daniel in the garden holding a sunflower, grinning like he had just won the world. On the back in his handwriting were the words, "For your stormy days. Love still grows." It took my breath away, not just because of the photo, but because someone somewhere had kept this memory safe, had waited until I was ready to hold it again. I started keeping a journal by the counter, a place where anyone could write something they wanted to say to someone they missed. It filled quickly with pages of raw, aching beauty, strangers connecting through sorrow and memory. I read it every night before closing and felt less alone. Daniel never really left me, not in the ways that matter. He was in the notes, in the mail, in the sunflowers that sometimes appeared on the doorstep, in the way people hugged me a little tighter after hearing my story. He was in the courage it took to open the shop, to face each morning, to believe that love outlives loss. And when I sit with my tea by the window watching the world move outside, I don't feel bitter, I feel full. I miss him every day, but I no longer live in that loss. I live in the love we built, in the lives we've touched, in the quiet, brave act of continuing. The years unfolded like the pages of a book, well read, well loved, the edges frayed with grief, but the spine unbroken. I turned each chapter with care, letting the days unfold, not with force, but with grace, and in every breath I took, Daniel was with me, not as a shadow of sadness, but as the light that softened every corner of my life. The town had changed, but the shop remained a place for quiet hope, for stories shared in whispers over steaming mugs, a place where people found solace without asking, and somehow I had become part of that healing too, people who never met. Daniel learned to love him through me, through the way I spoke of him and never allowed his memory to fade into silence. One spring morning, an old man walked in, his cane tapping gently against the wooden floor. He looked around with eyes that searched the past and finally said, I knew him, your Daniel. We served together once. I had no idea he was gone until I read about your story. He said nothing else, just sat for an hour, left a single daffodil and a note that said he was proud of who you became. I held that note too. My chest and cried for the 1000th time in quiet gratitude. I started writing letters to Daniel again. This time not out of longing, but out of joy, sharing small victories, telling him about the woman who finally opened her heart again, the boy, who stopped blaming himself, the man who found his lost daughter because he had overheard a story in my shop. My words became less about mourning and more about witness, bearing testimony to the fact that love in its purest form never ends. One autumn evening, a girl no older than 10 slipped a note into the journal. It said, "I think my dad loved my mom, but he died before I could ask her, do you think he still watches us?" I wrote back, "Yes, love is the only thing that looks both ways across forever." She came back. The next day with her mother, they stayed for hours and smiled with their eyes like something heavy had lifted. I never remarried, not because I didn't believe in love again, but because I had already lived a love so deep, so true, that I didn't need to replicate it. I carried it with me every moment of every day. It had shaped me, it had steadied me, and it had allowed me to give back in ways I never could have imagined. The final letter I wrote to Daniel was on a rainy night, much like the one we first met. I wrote that I was okay, that I had forgiven the pain, that I had filled the holes with light and laughter, that he could rest now because I was strong, because I was whole, because I loved him still, but needed no longer to be held by the past. I folded the letter and burned it in the fireplace, watching the smoke rise with peace in my chest. It didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like a beginning. The door opened, a breeze carried the scent of rain and sunflowers, and for a moment, I felt his hand in mine. No words, just presence, steady and warm and eternal.